have seen it I saw it first when I was 10. So then back then my dad has a shop, and right opposite there was a small shop where there was a man who was a tinsmith. And depending on who you are, you would call him Kadir with the Turkish name, or Kosten, apparently some kind of a corrupt version of Konstantinos. But he did assume, or I did assume back then, because I was too young to assess all these things. But people talked about him a lot. You know, there are lots of gossip, and people claim that he was one of the very few Greek families who didn't really leave the country. You know, there was a very big population exchange in the beginning of the century, 20th century. And the interesting thing is he was very interested in me. So I would really spend quite a couple of hours with him every day. And for once, he told me that these very weird words that we had in our Turkish dialect in the region, which for no reason, some of the names of the days are kind of different. So the first line, like Eina or Girei or Gireitesi, which translate as Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. And he asked me once, have you ever considered what they are? I said, I never consider. I'm just 10 years old. I didn't consider such things. And he told me back then that these are actually Greek words that we use in the dialect, which at the very down, coming from the Greek word ena, which is the first or one, or the Kyriaki, which is the real name of Sunday. That is when the Christians go to church. And Kyriaki Tesi is just a combination of the Tesi, the Turkish part, and the Greek one. Now, I still don't know if this is true or not, but this was the first time that I really thought, wait a minute, are there more languages than Turkish? Because I didn't know. And can they really be this much like one into another? And he was quite a lot. And when actually Anna asked me about this presentation, I really recalled these phrase that he used once, argucik argucuk, which was a kind of an adverb, like slowly, slowly hit the hammer, like hammer something slowly, because I used to help him sometimes. And only now I realize that probably that is in fact another way of Greek, that, well, in Greek there is this thing slowly, the word like argotsika. Probably that was also a corrupted version, because I still don't know if it can possibly be Turkish or not. So this was the very first time that I really saw about these tongues meeting in real life. That was very long. And years after, when I found myself in Greece doing this master's, without really knowing Greek, one of the professors gave me a book called The Dialect of Ulagac, apparently a village, which I was very oblivious about. Back then I was trying to learn Greek, modern Greek, that is. And when I was reading this book, suddenly it became like much more understandable than real Greek. It was apparently a Greek dialect, they call it. But when you navigate through the book, there are like lots and lots of words from Turkish that they really used, and they sounded very similar to what I know. As here I put düşündü, which is the Turkish word think, or rahatladı, which is the rahatla from Turkish, or çalıştı, and pages of words that they apparently use for Turkish, and not only verbs, obviously, quite a lot of nouns, as you can imagine. Perence, which was kind of corrupt version, I would say, of pencere, or her, some things that people think very difficult to navigate, every, or such things. And it was quite suddenly I remember talking to this professor saying that, why do I learn modern Greek? It seems much easier to me as a speaker of Turkish. Maybe I should really go on that, because it was not only words that were recognizable, but also the way people apparently were recorded in this book. I mean, the speakers were recorded in this book. In certain cases, the words weren't really Turkish, as in here in the blue, irthedoibnozim, which translates literally, my sleep came, which means I became sleepy, I'm sleepy. And that's exactly how I would say it in Turkish, that when you are sleepy, your sleep comes to you. So that's the way, although without the words. So quite a lot of sentences, even though you don't really know the words, but when you go back to check, translate, and suddenly the meaning without the words became quite similar to you. And that wasn't only, but there was quite a lot of divergences from what I was trying to learn, that is modern Greek, and what I see in this book. So say all these things called articles like the or a were completely missing. They didn't really have them. And their word order, like where they put their subject and the verb or the object or their nouns or adjectives, it was like, even though the words weren't really recognizable, in most cases they were, but even though they weren't, the order was very, very akin to what I was used to from Turkish, and quite a lot of sounds which were very difficult in the beginning to pronounce in modern Greek. They didn't really have them. And this is just the tip of an iceberg. There was lots and lots and lots of things. And in fact, that was the time that I said, okay, wait a minute, I really have to focus on this thing, which I don't know. People call it contact, but I don't know really how it works. And of course, back then I discovered that also, it's unfortunately, we don't really know our own history here in this part of the world, that there were many other villages as the village of Ulagaç in central Turkey, which in a region which was called Cappadocia. Most of them, all of them are gone actually by the 21st century, unfortunately, yet they must be somewhere. I thought, like in Greece or somewhere. These people shouldn't have just disappeared all over the place. And that really didn't. So it was really an eye-opener. And that was the time that I said, okay, I should really focus on this language contact thing that people call, and maybe I should start with the very, very basics of this so that I can read and things. Well, here in this very first part of this series of talks, I'm just going to share with my very early experiences and what I really remember from these very early readings and very early analyses, or you can't even call it analysis back then, but maybe they may be also interesting for you. The very first thing, obviously, that I remember, that for this thing to happen, which we call contact, that is when the tongues meet, obviously you need a place where they meet, right? Just you can have a mesh wireframe over here or any village or whatsoever. And this place, obviously, the more you read, the more you see. It can be, say, the Siwa oasis in Egypt in the 7th century BC, or the 13th century Cappadocia, which I was really, really interested in, or maybe Suriname, or to be Suriname in the first century, in the first half of the 17th century. Or the northern Norway, or the shores of Norway in particular in 1790s, or Singapore basically in the post-war era, or even very close in 2000s in the millennium, London or Berlin. So all of them really make places for this contact to happen. But it's not only a place that you really need, obviously, and you clearly also need the languages, but languages do not really exist by themselves, right? You need people. And ideally, there should be more than one person that they speak, so you need a community. Well, once you locate the community, obviously, now then you can say that essentially what does language contact do? Well, it changes things. But we also know that languages can change without really tongues meeting each other. Say from the first generation to the 20th generation, the colors of things can really change, even if you don't really find the usual suspect for another language. And we do know, and luckily we have a very nice subdiscipline for studying this type of change called diachronic linguistics, how really languages change. And when they change, what mechanisms do they follow? Who are the actors who really propagate the change, and so on and so forth. This is a very nice field of work on, and probably under its umbrella is the contact situation, because essentially when we talk about contact, we are assuming a change from A to B in time frame, and some magic happens in this between A and B, and suddenly we end up with this dictionary that I have shown you. But that clearly must have a lot of story in it, because to be first, you don't need one, but two to tango. Well, or to get the tongues meet each other, obviously. So there has to be the blacks and whites, or blues and whites, depending on what you say, so that they can meet. But how do they get into contact? What exactly? So the very, very basic thing. So it can really be very, very happily, you know, two people, like the history recorded this, obviously, two people just move to the same place, ideally in a loving manner. And what happens in the end is some kind of a very interesting compound of those tongues, as Herodotus already listed, already stated in the 5th century when we are talking about the Siva oasis, where apparently he talks about some colonists called Ammonians. They're colonists from Egypt and Ethiopia, and clearly they speak a language, according to him, compounded of the tongues of both countries. Well, this is one scenario where these things can happen. Really, the tongues can meet. Well, two people apparently lovingly meet in each other. But the world doesn't really work that way, I think, at least lately. So in Usual Suspects, what we really have is like there is one type of people, one group of people, and the other group, for whatever reason that there is, but usually for looking for new places or simply for domination or something, moves into the same area. Uh, might be actually very lovingly. Well, this is probably what has happened for many of these North American, well, very early North American natives when they saw the first Europeans. That's also recorded. But it doesn't really always happen that way. So usually when you go, you don't really go with good intentions, and usually you have your army and navy with you, and then the things can happen. Well, in fact, probably that was one of the ways how the Turkic people, when they moved into Anatolia, tried to dominate whatever they have found in the central western area called Karaman. Already in the 13th century, there's a decree for the bey for the local ruler of the area, who says that from now on, no one shall speak any language but Turkish in the place, in the meetings, or even when they go out in the street for a walk. And that brings, obviously, such schemata obviously bring a change, a very radical change in the languages, which we really call death. And that is as real as life itself. And probably you all know how fast they have been dying out there. And probably contact is, in fact, one of the very key fundamental mechanisms for this death. But they don't always die, at least not quickly. So if you are lucky enough to catch them before their death, according to some people, or when something stabilizes, whatever you find this stabilized variety is actually what I have shown you in the dialect. So that, like, so much combination of the things, so much so that, as Dawkins, when he, a man from Cambridge, when he visited these villages of Cappadocia, had the same feeling as I did. Like, wait a minute, this seems Greek, but the soul is Turkish. The Turkish has replaced the Greek spirit. The body, okay, you can say that it's still Greek, but the soul, all these idioms and everything, like, you know, as if when you speak Turkish, people are going to understand you, but that doesn't really work. Well, I tried, it does, but ideally it doesn't really. So it's still another dialect where their color changes, actually. So there are lots of things from Turkish or whatever language that comes after, incorporated into their native system. And that's the typical contextuation that we have, and probably that we are going to be focusing on the next two talks. So many other contextuations, context phenomena, or ecologies come into mind. I know most of them, what I say, are very trivial, but it's better to be trivial to go into complicated, because in many places it's going to come up as such that language context studies is kind of a mess. Another contextuation is like, you don't really go for dominion or something. You just have some very specific reason to go and meet someone else, and then whatever you have, you just do it, and then you live. So it's just based on some shared idea, shared aim. And one of the shared aims is, of course, barter or the trade. And quite a lot of trade posts have existed in the history where people from different regions came, they did whatever that they had to do, and then they just left. But when they did come together, obviously, and we are not talking about an era where Google Translate really existed, so you really needed to communicate, but to communicate in a very small domain, whatever you need, you have to do this, and then that's it. People can really be creative. Think about two inmates who do not really know each other's language and they have been put into the same cell. I guess I would bet quite hardly on the fact that in less than 2 weeks they will start talking, whatever mesh that there is. One such case is in fact covers the entire Levant on the Eastern Mediterranean, especially in the from the 14th century onwards, almost all the way to the end of the 18th century. There was lots of trade going on in the Ottoman Empire, also from the Westerners and the like. And here Hughes, who states for the 15th century, humming across the Ottoman Empire and with particular vigor around Istanbul, could be heard the original lingua franca, well, the language of the Franks, a base of Italian. Yeah, you can recognize it as an Italian, but with added Greek, Turkish, Arabic, Spanish, and French elements, and you only need it when you do the trade or pirating. Some examples have been recorded from the 17th century. Here, Galland, when he visited Smyrna or Izmir today, that's the first one. I mean, if anyone knows Italian, which I don't, it may sound similar to Italian, but there seems to be quite a lot of simplification going on. I mean, you don't really make it clear who the subject is, or some things seem to be missing that should be in an ideal universe where people would speak proper Italian. And the translation already makes it clear that such sentences, of course, hurt, but in very specific domains. Say, when you want to buy something or when you really want to sell something. Or the same thing also partly happened in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, in northern Norway, where the Russian traders came and met these Norwegian fishermen, and they had to barter their skin with the fish that they had, so that everyone spends the winter happily. Well, in the absence of translators, what happens is that you find your way quickly to do whatever you have, to sell your skin or barter your skin with the best of salmon and leave. But in order to do that, you need this language. In order to not be very bossy or something, it's better to try to incorporate some other person's things too. So over here, the red ones stay obviously as the Russian ones, Dada Moya, Kopom, Altsama, which the yellow ones are from Norwegian. And the person is saying that is recorded in 1878. Yes, I will buy all of it. Come on board. That is the skin. And while, of course, doing these things, while making this mesh out of these two things, things can kind of stabilize also. Some things that really exist neither in one nor the other kind of become standard of the code as the that is in white. That doesn't really exist for Russian or Norwegian, but it seems like the verbs, when they have an object, like as in eat the sandwich, that you always have to add this at the end. Yet more situations, of course, come to mind, and they have been very properly recorded all across the globe. And in one such situation, which we know is a very painful, is that a place with its own inhabitants have been taken over by a foreign rule, in many cases, so that they need more plantations, more places to grow crops in an industrial scale. It doesn't always go very well according to the history, because in many contexts, because of these early settlers that are not the natives, and the natives are not really used to the diseases or whatever that there is, the native population can really disappear as the one here, or not. It depends. But the interesting thing is, because in such places you really need a lot of labor, and the ruling elite doesn't like this work that much. You know that they don't want to do this alone themselves. They bring many other people, and these people can come in flux from different parts of the world. And as the callers say, they may not really understand each other. And then you bring all these people and you want them to cultivate the land and harvest the cotton or the sugar canes or whatsoever. These people need to talk, need to communicate, no matter how you have. And the moment you put them here, it also means that they have to stay there in generations. And once the magic happens, you end up with a mesh that people call Creoles. Over here is the Suriname, from Suriname, the Suriname Tango that they call, may be recognizable, some words from Dutch. I don't know. But it seems like there are lots of Dutch elements in it, yet also many other elements that come from these flock of people who have been brought by slavery into these places. And they start with their own life. Over here, I tried to translate the Johannes first. In the beginning, there was a word, and that goes on. Well, sorry, it's getting a lot, but more situations yet come in, so that we can play with all cards, so that we can proceed in a better way in the next time. Sometimes a small group, of course, simply migrates for a better life, and well, Europeans must very well know this. So lots of workforce came from Middle East or Northern Africa since the 1950s all across Europe. And what happens to them, actually? They don't really go back. Well, they didn't. So they just, they become more in number. They just have babies, have children. Even though the first generation, the people that really went there didn't really master the language, the second or the third generation are getting very well at this. But are they really? Well, or maybe there are some other things that are going on. In one way, what happens can really happen in their ancestral language over here, which we can call Turkish. And in fact, a master's student of mine have been working with these people, this third generation Turkish speakers in London. And there is like a very striking recurring thing in this younger population. And that I tried to put in this example. The gray part is the most important one, where it says üç arkadaşlarına. Now, from a very Turkish perspective, no matter which dialect of it you go, whenever you have this number üç, which means three, then you never put the plural on the noun, lar, the s, in friends. But it is extremely systematic in these third generation youngsters that whenever there is a noun, numeral, üç arkadaş, like üç, three, the noun that follows it always comes with plural. And this also happens with things that people call quantifiers, like some or few, which are completely ungrammatical from a Turkish perspective. And I bet it was also ungrammatical for their parents. Well, I don't only bet, I know for evidence that it's not. But the youngsters really made it into their part. And the small things, obviously, are a sign of the fact that, well, they started learning their ancestral language, their mother's language, obviously at home. But they don't really stay all the time at home. The moment they start schooling, or the moment they just leave home and find themselves out in the street, there is a whole other language which we call English. And the more you're exposed to it, things can happen to your language. And at a certain point, it gets really these attrition effects or this influence from English. And it may really some of these examples of these influences can really characterize a certain population, which has its own name, called the heritage speakers. Or they can also make it in the other direction, obviously, right? So while they are doing this, they also try to learn the language of the population, the bigger population into which they were immersed. But things may not always go perfectly. Sometimes they don't really feel that they are belonging somewhere. They don't belong properly, neither in one to the other. And then on those places, you really try to flag your identity that I am neither one nor the other, either deliberately or unconsciously, the essential content, the outcome. But whatever the reason is, the outcome from a monolingual, so to speak, the person who speaks the language of the majority may really not like it. As here, Wiese, well, he was talking to a 54-year-old German teacher, and the lady is giving his opinion about these youngster Arabic Turkish people who speak German, but with their own way. And she says, well, they speak in shreds, the syntax is simplified, and that contributes to the deterioration of the German language. Well, agree or not, it's not my position, obviously. But what I'm after is that clearly all these things that this lady is trying to formulate are essentially changes that these people are incorporating into German. Like, you would ideally expect this verb geh right after morgen, but it doesn't really happen. And these things really happen systematically for these speakers. I don't know if they really don't know it or they really choose this way. These are very nice questions to ask. And these have been recorded in Berlin. But similar things you can really record in many places, and they did record it all the way from Sweden to northern Italy, in fact. Related to these, maybe these people who come have so much fear, so to speak, I mean, just to put it in general forms, that they really want to separate, that they create a code, a secret code that they have only for themselves. In many places, of course, this again works for an identity that is, you can only speak this language when you're in the insider of this group of people who have migrated. And this can really be the categorizer, like the classifier of the whole population. One such language we detected in northeastern Turkey called Chankari, just in a very small neighborhood where there are people who the literature thinks is Romani, but they say categorically reject the identity. But what happens for them is like they speak when they want to be secret in a code, in a language where you have things from both Armenian and Turkish. So, but they are the things what you use from both languages are clearly segregated. You have designated slots for whichever you put. Over here, there was one sentence that the lady uttered to me. Gadunum porianutia. Well, the yellow ones are Armenian. If anyone knows Armenian, it is easy. Gato is the cat, or por is the stomach. Anut is open, and ye is like is, the openness. But then these nun and u are from Turkish. So it's the genitive, so to speak, and the possessive that they have it. So such mixtures characterize them, and they think that speaking in this way, they can really save themselves and protect their identity. This is, for many people, is a deliberate decision to mixture. So these are potentially a couple of the cases where I could think of how this ecology, the topology, can be filled with contact environments. You can, of course, think many more, obviously, right? There can be many, many more of them. But what we have said so far, in fact, points to a very, very important direction. So if you really are going to talk about contact, or even you're going to utter the word contact, you have to really know about the socio-historical background of all these people. You without that, it doesn't really work. You really have to be very aware of what has happened historically, who went, how did it happen. And in fact, all these contact scenarios that I have given so far materialize into sediments that people have given names, like pidgins or creoles or bilingual mixed languages or ethnolegs or heritage languages, that underlie the fact that the naming is in fact correlated with the socio-historical background of the speakers, not necessarily what you see ultimately, but how these things really emerge is the fact. So then clearly the first thing that I learned was the full account of a context situation is possible only if these extra linguistic factors, that what happened to whom and how, are considered. Now, some people think that you can only, and this is the only predictor of the things, but my aim is not to predict anything, just to describe things. I would like to illustrate these things, the grossness for my own work, how this can be related. Well, for me, it is interesting, and I hope you can share this, the same enthusiasm that I have. While I started this work with Cappadocian or many other Greek dialects that followed afterwards, or even others, from which I will give you more examples. Well, Cappadocian villages are the ones that clustered on the left, where there are lots of dots, if you can see, well, in Niğde and Nevşehir, those are the provinces. This is not a homogeneous thing. When they were recorded in the 1916 in this book, we have this understanding that the very southern ones, like Ulagaç and Semendere, these are names of the villages. Well, in fact, when he said that the Turkish replaced the Greek spirit, Dawkins had in mind the southern villages, because here it is the case that the Turkish element is at its strongest. The dialect is, according to him, in fact, rapidly giving way as a vernacular to Turkish. And he really foresaw that back then, of course, there was no such thing as population exchange. Well, he really didn't know that they would be kicked out of Turkey in 6 years. And he said, like, in 20 years, they will all be gone in the southern one. But when you look at the northern one, where the yellow one is, which is the hub, you can call Sinasos is another village, and its neighbors have been very much preserved from any strong influence, so much so that when you read the text, it doesn't really make striking things. It seems like you're reading a text in modern Greek from the 1890s. It just doesn't. And the interesting thing is between the northest village and the southest one, there isn't barely 45 kilometers. Well, it's important, but why is this difference? Apparently, everything seems to be the same. Like, we are talking about Greek, we are talking about Turkish, there is nothing else in the middle, and one of them is so much influenced and the other one is not. Well, the idea goes probably to one thing, that you have to be aware of the social linguistic history or whatever that they had. Well, to begin with, when he visited the place, it was a very, like the southern village, it was a very, very poor place. Unfortunately, well, still is to a certain extent, but back then I can't even imagine. One lady from the village told me that they were very rich when they were in Turkey. And I said, what do you mean rich? Like, what rich is it? She said, yeah, we had a pig. And nothing else, so just a pig. So, but she was very happy back then, remembering her very early childhood. And not only the poorness, and poorness, of course, brings a lot of motivation to earn money. And it is this urge to earn money that the men would always live all the way as far as the western shores of Turkey, herding sheep. And the women were also leaving, taking their kids and going to the bigger cities like Niğde, well, bigger towns, where they would do housekeeping for the richer people. And the richer people in this context were mostly Turkish speakers. And they were bringing a lot of things from these places. Well, lots of things in the sense of linguistic elements, so that you can fill up a whole dictionary without really putting one single origin Greek word. But in the north, it was the culprit. There was one culprit. There is this blue line passing, which is a river, Kızılırmak, which is the ancient Halys. Now it's like a dream, but apparently all the way until the end of the 19th century, the sturgeon from this river was extremely well paid in European markets, especially in Vienna. And the sturgeon produces caviar. And what we know is that all these villages were extremely rich because of having a monopoly on the caviar industry, just because of the village. So we noted case after case, like the non-Muslim of Cappadocia, which means the northern ones, had a monopoly on the caviar industry in the late Ottoman era, selling the caviar of the sturgeon coat and Kızılırmak to European markets in Constantinople. And in the fish market of Istanbul, there were 200 such caviar merchants in 1912. And that means that they had a lot of contacts with the metropolitan city, and they had the money. The money brings a lot of things, among others, education. So they could spend money on keeping a teacher which could teach the kids modern Greek. And for this very close context, all this mercenary, Sinassos, this very rich place, has been in close contact with Constantinople. And he says, I doubt indeed if the dialects ever been so corrupt. So he never thinks that Turkish was ever any part of this dialect, because they have always been rich. And if you visit the villages today, you also see the richness, how these beautiful old houses scattered all around. So it's maybe an exaggeration to put the blame, or whatever you call it, on one river, but that's essentially true. Just knowing this fact really brings along a whole distinction in what outcome comes from a contact, even in seemingly the same situations, even in seemingly same ecologies. Well, once you have this, then there are lots of questions to ask, obviously, right? When you are talking about this tongues meeting. So the demographic facts, how many people moving in, moving out, and what is the relationship, the socially or politically or economically between them? Did they really have attitudes against each other, or is one of them really institutionally supported, schooling or whatsoever in the case of Sinassos, and how long they have been together? So all these questions come, and many more, as very crucial questions when you want to do this contact thingy. But it's not enough yet. So just simply focusing on this would be, if you ask me, to summarize a best-selling novel in one sentence, because many more things happen. So it just, this A and B points and the line in between have to be properly filled, because, well, to begin with, if you want to talk about contact, remember that languages don't really touch each other, and they have to touch each other in one place, and that place is probably the bilingual minds. So languages do not cross borders. They cross borders only with their carriers. That is the people who can really understand these two people. And if you really want to talk about a contact outcome, you really first have to look at the people who have generated this variation. So some people have to initiate this, right? All these verbs that I have listed, or many other things, that the loss of article was started somewhere in the remote past or in the recent past. And where? In what context? By whom? And it's not only the fact that they introduced this. By assumption, you can say that they also introduced many other things, like these bilinguals, a lot of variation, but not all of them stick. So we have to also look at the innovators of this change, like how a change started its life in this community, so that we can really find the aftermath. And people have a name for this. They call it actuation or generation of variation or whatsoever, in the sense that who are the agents? Who really brought this? Well, the very first question that comes is that, okay, then if I want to give a proper analysis of a context change, I should really know well about the bilingual language acquisition, because the moment you talk about this stereotypically, you're talking about bilinguals who are acquiring these two languages and how they maintain their languages, in fact. One example comes from Singapore, colloquial English for that. And what we have over here is, in this colloquial Singapore English, Singlish that they call, there is this thing already. Well, of course, these are English sentences 1 and 2, but the way that the Singapore colloquial English speakers use it is somehow off, somehow differently than the standard English speakers or many other English speakers out there. Like, I wash my hands already, the tongue read already. And quite a lot of theoretical linguists say that this is, in fact, not an already that we know in English, but a marker, like a grammatical thing that marks that the event is completed. So if you would like to really properly translate one, you should have said, I have washed my hands, or the tongue turned red completely. And well, it comes apparently from an influence of Hokkien or Sinitic influence, where they have this already with exactly the same form or the function as in 3 our bus returned home already, which means our bus has returned home. Well, this is the end of the context situation, what we see in colloquial English. But then there are some other people out there who are very keen on tracing how these things can emerge. And one of them is this Quanteri in 1989, and he looked at Cantonese English bilingual children, like children who was grown up from the first day on hearing English and Cantonese. And as early as the 3rd year, they were already using this already as a completive marker, as a bilingual maintenance thing, bilingual acquisition thing. So the interaction already happens when they were acquiring these 2 languages that they have. And such bilinguals introduce a lot of variation out there. Believe me, I know it for one from my own daughter. So I have been keeping a log. She is growing Flemish, Turkish bilingual. And the thing she introduces the whole time is really interesting. So a verb like düşmek, to be falling, to fall, and just inflecting it in the Flemish way. Or I think she's using the heb wrongly, but doesn't really matter. She tries. Or the blauwig bill, she has no sense of verb second, none. Or quite a lot of times, especially, well, this luckily stopped a couple of months ago, but she was recursively putting this so-called question marker at the end of her questions. And the question marker we use in Turkish, if you want to ask something as a yes-no question, you have to add this mi. And she was repeatedly putting this, even in the absence of evidence from any person who speaks Flemish. And even if my wife tried hard that it's not working, she wasn't really getting it. And probably these bilingual people or people who acquire these languages, bilinguals, introduce a lot of variation out there. So we have to really know about how the bilingual language maintenance really works. Or the second language acquisition is also something very important for understanding how things are actually initiated. In this southern Turkey, the dialect is kind of divergent, if you ask my opinion, from the standard variety. For one thing, they have these so-called models, like can, as a separate verb. As over here, they're trying to say a tortoise cannot walk fast. It's from a field work that we had. And repeatedly, they just, if they want to say a sentence with can or cannot, they just use this add me. And that's it's quite different than the standard Turkish, in which we put this can right after the verb, like tortoise fast, walk cannot, with something that we call suffixes. But it's so much in the mouth of every single person in the Southeast that it just characterizes the dialect that they have it. So when you go and write the grammar, you would probably put that they have modal verbs. And clearly, you can only find one's usual suspect for such things. That's the Kurmanji that's being spoken widely in the area. And many people are, in fact, a second language speakers of Turkish in the area. So they have probably introduced this can with the Turkish words from their native tongue. So essentially, they are the characterizers, like the initiators of this change that have become part of the reality of the region. So many other things come into mind. Of course, such newnesses can be introduced in many other mechanisms like code switching or in attrition, or even, as we have seen, deliberately people can really change things. So we have to be aware of all these mechanisms while we are looking at the situation that we have in mind. Once you have these people, the early creators of this, that's not really enough, right? So to be able to talk about the contact-induced phenomenon, ideally you should be able to see it in a sizable population, which kind of segregates, separates it from the rest. That is, the variant that has been introduced into the society has to be selected, have to be accepted by the wider variety, including probably monolingual children that have to be their own life. But this essentially brings us another question: how these introduced variation doesn't really disappear stochastically, and they just stick. So why one verb stays and the other verb doesn't? Well, this is too much of a very specific question, but something can happen. Is it because that they are really, whatever is associated, whatever is introduced, is immediately associated with some special traits? Can all these Greek villages, well, not only, but Laz villages or many local languages in or across Anatolia, when they want to swear, they really swear in Turkish, because it seems that it sounds heavier when they swear in Turkish than in their native tongues. Or for the population, probably the important thing is how many L2 speakers were there, which also brings us to the population dynamics, like who was interacting with what, how these things select, how they propagate. Can we also talk about the adopter groups? Some people really accept things very easily, but some are very reluctant, right? You can also associate it with yourself. Or did they really simply because of random fluctuation that some things just happen haphazardly and something not? And how about the failed innovations? As we said, quite a lot of things are introduced by bilinguals, but not all of them stay. I think I have one example. In the northeast of the country, there are 3 languages that are spoken. Well, Turkish, Laz, Georgian-like language, South Caucasian, and Greek again. When you look at Laz, and if you want to say something like, I was surprised that you broke the stone, that you, the pronoun you, comes as your, like with the so-called genitive. And when you compare it to any closest cognate, or historically speaking, it wasn't. You would never say your, you would say you. But now it has just become part of the language. It's your. So you have to put this genitive to express the subject of the sentence, that the embedded sentence that you broke the stone. If something has a prepositional content, its subject have to be in the genitive if it is embedded. And many people think that it's, of course, because of the Turkish influence over there. So the bilingualism was the culprit in the region, because in Turkish you have to put this genitive, otherwise it doesn't really work. So the sen, you, have to be within. Hence, you have to say your if you really want to say the same sentence. Now, the interesting thing is, the same thing also happens in the region in Greek. Which is I want sevdas studying, which means I want sevda to study, where you would put the genitive. But the problem is, now with my PhD student, he has been looking at cross-generation variation and heritage speakers in this village. But this is systematically done by the elderly. Like if you're above 60, you do that. If you're 30, you don't accept it anymore. They say no. So it feels like there is a change that is failing, that have been introduced, kind of phrase, and now it's failing back. And that's interesting to ask why it is happening. So they can fail, that is. So all these things, the socio-historical background, how the variants are introduced, and how they can propagate, of course, have to be looked at through the lenses of the structural and typological factors. Truly, it takes 2 to tango, but not every 2 really mates. So there has to be some kind of structural congruence. So no matter how much you try, it's very difficult to accommodate it into your language. And there can also be certain mechanisms, like while it's working, and there can be some constraints on them. And through this, you can also look at the resilience and vulnerability, like what parts of language are really resilient, what parts are really vulnerable in such contexts. And the combination of all then gives us the thing that we teleologically say contact outcome. That is essentially what you call this pigeon or ethnolect, or these genitive subjects is essentially the output of these dynamic nonlinear system, which fluctuations in one place can really affect the whole outcome. The problem is, hence, for all these things, in order to make some understanding of all these parts, you have to really use the tools that have been devised in almost disparate fields, disciplines like sociolinguistics, diachronic linguistics, acquisition. You have to know typology and theoretical linguistics, or there will be a lot of gaps which can be filled with computational linguistics and simulations and the like, or the psycholinguistics to understand how actuation really happens for these individuals. And the problem is, in many places we don't really have this data. It's very easy to say than done. Unfortunately, there is the whole thing which is called the imperfection of textual data, which Marike last year put very beautifully. And that also is for contact cases. In many cases, you do this reverse engineering by looking at the teleology. What you see, you try to reconstruct whatever has happened or probably have happened. And in fact, Labov, while talking about historical linguistics and saying that it's the art of making the best use of bad data, here what we have is, in many cases, the art of making the best use of no data. That is like, who is going to give the best story or for whatever has happened with whatever little tools you have. I think I'm done for today, but what I'm going to do the next is to look at how we can reconstruct the contact history with this little data we have. It's going to be a little more technical than this, but not too much. And then on the third one, by looking at all these disparate subdisciplines, I'm going to come to what generalizations can we make for the broader audience in terms of language contact. I think that's it. Thank you. Thank you so much for today.